The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that may result from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. I'm Nathaniel Darkish.
This is Max George.
Oh, and it's not just the Scream Kings podcast.
My name is Charlie Conlon, and I'm the host of the Knowing My Nightmares podcast.
This is a combined episode.
Yeah, should be interesting.
It's the first for the Scream Kings. We've been trying to do this for quite a while, so thank you, Charlie, for being the first.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. So I guess for our audience who may not be familiar with you, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit there, Charlie?
Yeah, sure. My name is Charlie Conlon, and I'm the host of the Knowing My Nightmares podcast. My podcast, I would say, is a horror story podcast at its core. Each episode is based off a story, and the story is based out of a nightmare that I've actually had. And then I take the dream elements from the nightmare and analyze them, and then people can pull from that if they've had similar experiences.
Cool. And I have to say, I really have enjoyed listening to the episodes I've listened to. It's very creepy stuff, and I enjoy kind of seeing your evaluation of what makes up the elements of the dreams.
Thanks.
And your episode, The Banshee, terrified me. I listened to it on a drive, and it was not my favorite thing to listen to, in the best of ways.
Yeah, well, that episode's actually all of the episodes take place roughly in places that I've been, and that one takes place in my sister's bedroom with the 3 windows.
That doesn't make it better.
I know. I don't think she can actually sleep in that room anymore. So that was pretty fun.
All right. So I guess other than the podcast, what's just a little bit about you, and can you share just sort of your credentials as a horror fan and things like that?
Well, I went to school originally for television, and in that I got involved with a lot of projects and indie films and things like that. But in terms of like horror, I was introduced to it at a very, very early age, around 6 years old, or 6 or 7. I watched The Sixth Sense for the first time, and it scarred me for life. Still can't go to the washroom at night without kind of closing the door behind me, thinking something's going to walk past the door.
That's fair. That scene is pretty traumatizing.
Right. And then when I was about 8 years old, I started hanging out with this one kid, and we would have a sleepover every single weekend, and every single weekend we would knock off another horror movie. So I would say at the age of 8, I condensed pretty much every single horror movie within that year. So I was pretty desensitized at a very early age and just completely fell in love with the genre.
Well, it's a great genre to be in love with. So I'm curious, are there, is there a favorite scary movie you have? What's the scariest movie you've seen? We talked about this a little bit before the show, but yeah, I kind of want to hear what you have for us.
Well, yeah, I like I said or before, this was a really hard question because there's just such a huge roster of scary movies, and my favorite scary movie of all time would have to be Poltergeist, because I just have so much fun with it, and I think in terms of favorite scary movie, it's one that you can watch when you're have a sick day or something, and it makes you feel good, and you're like, oh, that's fun, but. It was a 3-way tie between Poltergeist, Candyman, and The Shining.
Ugh, all fantastic movies.
Yeah.
Candyman. Not a lot of people appreciate Candyman as
Candyman is incredible. The soundtrack in that movie is the best.
And the weird nightmare imagery, and yeah.
Right, and then that doesn't even get into The Gate or The Thing or Evil Dead 1, 2, and 3 or any of those
All right, we're going to get along this episode. You're speaking our language here.
But in terms of scariest, this one was hard for me because there are so many scary movies throughout my life where I feel like there was a scary one that I thought was scariest each decade, but I'm going to have to say the scariest is Hereditary.
Yes! We are very big fans of Hereditary.
Yeah. we have long made the joke that we are basically just a Hereditary fan cast at this point, so...
Well, I just finished listening to your 2-part series on Hereditary, and it was really awesome.
Well, thank you so much. And
maybe...
yeah, we can't wait for Midsummer in, 3 days?
I'm
4
so
days?
excited.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, I mean, Hereditary, like, that is the best cinematography I've ever seen in a movie, by far.
And mixed with the horror elements. I mean, we shouldn't focus this too much or we'll talk about it nonstop.
Right. But I would have to say, just really quickly, that was the only time I've ever seen a movie where it cuts to the opening shot of the house, or like an exterior shot of the house, and it's all tilt shift. And I audibly said in the theater, wow.
Oh, that's great.
But yeah, so that would probably be the scariest.
So maybe that's a good segue to kind of tell maybe some of your listeners who are not familiar with the Scream Kings who we are.
Yeah, what are your favorite scary movies and favorites horror movies?
Do you want to go first, Max?
Absolutely. My favorite scary movie, again, it's kind of evolving. I'm trying to think of it, and right now it's a 3-way tie. When we first started our podcast, it was As Above, So Below. I'm kind of an occult fanatic. I love demons. I love spellcasting. I love mythology, all of that. And I felt like As Above, So Below really tied in a lot of those cool elements. I love found footage videos, and so it was just kind of the perfect horror package for me.
Right.
But then I was introduced to the remake of Evil Dead, and that scared me shitless for quite a while.
It's a pretty good movie.
Oh, it's fantastic. And right now, I've been binging Beetlejuice lately. I don't know if I would consider it quite horror or horror comedy, but it's one of those
It's
movies,
fun, though.
It's one of those movies you could watch on repeat and never get bored. It's so fantastic.
It's true. Beetlejuice is definitely a mainstay for movies that my wife and I watch to sleep.
And there's a Broadway musical now, which is amazing as well. And I'm a Broadway fanatic too, so it's all perfect. It's all lining up for me.
Everything's coming up, Max.
Everything's coming up.
Have you seen the Evil Dead musical?
No, but I'm writing that down right now.
It's pretty great. First three rows are a blood splatter zone.
Oh my god!
Yeah, you have to wear a poncho.
Yeah, it's true.
The scariest horror movie I think is Hereditary, hands down. So we're in alignment there.
It's again, it's just an incredible movie.
The demonology behind that movie, the whole mythos of Payman and how they are like conjuring him was just like the biggest occult gasm I think I've ever had in a movie.
Okay, and then for me, my favorite scary movie, it's probably tied between Alien and Silence of the Lambs.
Oh, both great. Yeah,
just two fantastic movies. I will watch them over and over again forever. And then probably the scariest, also Hereditary, because... Well, the reasons we have already talked about.
Right. We should, man, I could just talk all day about Hereditary. It's hard not to.
Yeah.
So could we. But that's not why we're here.
Right.
So today we wanted to talk about sleep paralysis. Who wants to kick us off?
And maybe more generally, we want to talk about the movie The Nightmare, which is a really awesome kind of mockumentary on Netflix. And when I found Charlie's podcast, it was, again, the stars were lining up. We were coming up. Max reached out to you because you have such an incredible background in this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Unfortunately, sleep paralysis, I do suffer from sleep paralysis, like at least once a month.
Wow.
It's very intense. And The Nightmare did a pretty good job of, like getting into it and what it was. Unfortunately, there's obviously some problems with the movie.
So
yes.
Tell us about your dreams. You know, in your podcast, every episode is based around these incredibly detailed and vivid dreams you've had. When did this start for you? Did it start when you were 8 watching the horror movies? Has it kind of developed and evolved as you've gotten older? Like, take us through that.
Well, I would say it's definitely developed and evolved as I've gotten older. But I mean, everybody has nightmares, and you have nightmares throughout your entire life. But for me, it was more so I started getting the reason why I wanted to start the podcast was, again, horror stories at its core. And all of these horror stories were happening in my own head all the time, that I was like, I should write this down. And then I started the thing about dream analysis and getting into it and all that is, if you start actually writing down your dreams when you wake up, then you actually start dreaming more. And it's kind of like this snowball effect of the more you start recognizing dreams and getting into it, that the more frequently start happening. But for me, it really started taking off at a stressful time in my life where my nightmares were happening very frequently, but I was enjoying them. If that makes sense. Because for me, I started actually going and saying to my wife, what was that movie we were watching the other day where this happened? And she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, right, that was a nightmare I had. So I started actually getting my own nightmares mixed up with books I was reading and movies I was watching. And I was like, I should share these. This is scary stuff. So that's kind of how the podcast started.
That's incredible. And so do you feel like, for those who aren't familiar with dreaming, there's a term that we use, lucid dreaming, where you actually know you're dreaming, so you can kind of direct where the adventure, quote unquote, is going. Is that something you also experience in the sleep paralysis, or are they very separated?
Well, every time I nightmare, every time I have a nightmare, it's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily line up with a sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is still relatively rare, but it's just like once in a while. They usually happen when I have naps, and specifically if I'm laying on my back. It's interesting. This is actually a pretty good segue into sleep paralysis, but every time I try and actively lucid dream, I trigger sleep paralysis.
Okay. Interesting.
And it's always met with something terrifying in a dream. In my Slender Man episode, there's a part where I'm looking in the peephole and I see him at the end of the hallway at my apartment, and he comes down the hallway. That was a nightmare that I actually had, but when he reached the peephole, I woke up and triggered by sleep paralysis. So there are a lot of things that happen within my dream that trigger it, rather than I wake up and it's already happening.
Interesting.
And anytime I attempt to lucid dream, because a lot of people can naturally lucid dream and they don't even know it. There's a lot of people who can hone the skill of actually doing it, but it takes a lot of practice and patience. But for me, every time I try and do it, it literally I wake up anytime I try and I'm frozen.
And that is not worth it.
It's not. It really isn't, because it does get to the point where you're like, oh, is it worth it? It's very scary. And, a lot of the times it's met with the hallucinations that are talked about in the movie The Nightmare.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive right in. Like, what is sleep paralysis? As far as I understand, it's this weird physiological response that our brains go through while we're sleeping, where we wake up, but we're still in that kind of REM dream state. So we are taking in visual stimuli that is there, but also not there. It's a real weird kind of mind game.
It's like, yeah, you're right. It's kind of like an in-between space.
Yeah, because my understanding of it is that the mind still doesn't fully realize that you're fully awake yet, and so even though you are able to be aware of your surroundings, you're able to look around, the part of your body that keeps you from moving around as you're interacting with a dream is still active, and so you're stuck.
Right. It's the muscles in your body are still sleeping, but your mind is awake, is essentially what it is. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes lucid dreaming can spill over into your waking life. There was an experiment. I've been studying dream stuff my entire life, and when I was 16 years old, my friend and I stayed up for 5 days straight, because if you stay up a certain amount of time, you actually start dreaming in your surroundings while you're awake. So it's kind of the same thing, you just can't move.
Jeez, that sounds horrifying.
Yeah, I have some friends who every year during the summer, they would stay up for like 4 or 5 days straight until they started getting a little bit hallucinatory, and then go to the local theme park lagoon, and said that it was the trippiest experience ever because they're riding roller coasters while hallucinating.
Well, yeah, and I mean, even if you've stayed up for that long and you're driving in a car, you're technically intoxicated and can get a ticket for impaired driving.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of the crazy thing to me too is when you Google sleep paralysis and you look into kind of the scientific research, there's not a lot out there. There's no real drugs or medications that you can use to control it. It's very misunderstood, and I think that in itself has caused a lot of kind of the mythology to be developed from it. You know, this is where people say that they've been abducted by aliens, that they've been visited by ghosts, that they have succubi, incubi, demons. Like, it's crazy. The craziness is out there.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of alien, ghosts, demons lore. It's very interesting, and there's this book that I've read called Dream Images from the Afterlife, and it talks about seeing deceased loved ones coming to you with messages and talking to you in your dreams and things like that. And in that book, it talks about near-death experiences, and that when you have a near-death experience, you kind of have one foot firmly on the other side, and it can be accessed through dreams. So there could be, like, I believe in this theory that if I'm seeing these apparitions through my sleep paralysis, like, what's to say they aren't? Because I have had a near-death. When I was 10, I was hit by a car and was essentially dead for about 3 minutes. So I've had a near-death experience. So I'm wondering if that's why I have so many vivid dreams and sleep paralysis.
Almost like it kind of breaks down that veil or bridge in some regards, so you can kind of see past that.
Yeah, something like that. And I mean, like, when you're in the moment of sleep paralysis and you do see these images, it's kind of hard not to think that, because, like, what if I'm seeing somebody standing in my room and to me it's real, and I've got this sensation through my body, which is essentially a vibration, and I can't move.
Yeah, and along those lines, a lot of times people experience not just, seeing things in addition to the, lack of movement, but also a lot of times people will feel like a sensation like they're being pressed down into their bed, things like that. And so, that really, I'm sure, heightens the experience, because it's not just a, visual hallucination or vision or whatever. There's also, a lot of times, other senses being activated as well in a really sometimes terrifying, or sometimes, I guess maybe even a transcendent sort of way.
And I mean, in terms of talking about the movie The Nightmare, there is something very interesting in that movie where they were talking about auditory hallucinations, which to me was the scariest part. I don't know if you guys want to get into the movie or...
Before we get there, I want to know some of your experiences, what you've seen. I mean, I know your podcast has a lot of these stories in it, but do you have a few that jump out to you that really kind of affected you?
Yes. I have 4 distinct scenarios that have happened to me. And they were all in the same year. The first one, which this one was greatly affected me after I saw The Nightmare, because there's a part in that movie that is similar to this. I woke up into my bed, and if I'm laying in my bed, my door is essentially at the foot of my bed and to the right. So I woke up in my bed, frozen, unable to move. And usually when this happens, in my head, I'm screaming for my wife to wake me up, but I'm literally just laying there in silence. So I look over at my door, and there's a cloaked man standing in the doorway.
Nope.
And then he just grows to about 9 feet, and he's so tall that he's like ducking under the ceiling.
Nope.
And then I'm sitting there, literally sweat dripping down my brow, unable to move, trying to scream for my wife. And this thing takes 3 gigantic steps swiftly over to me while I'm laying in my bed, and then just disappears.
Nope.
He looked like death. He looked like essentially death.
Ah, that's crazy.
Yeah, so that one was really scary. And then the second one was it was like a 6-year-old boy playing in my room, but he was dressed like from the 1930s in like overalls.
Oh, wow.
And he was just kind of playing around the room, and he was just kind of not caring that I was there, and just kind of, again, I was just kind of like noped out of there and went back to bed. But that one was weird. The third one was, again, in my doorway, there was a hunched over old woman. Kind of looked like a medieval beggar.
The hag!
The hag. So, this woman was sitting in the doorway, all hunched over, and she was kind of like twiddling her fingers. And then she quickly shuffled over to my bed, like the big tall man, where they're always coming at me. And she like shuffled over and just disappeared again. But it was really terrifying because her face was all like, she looked like a leper, essentially.
That's super interesting because the hag is so like well known. Like,
yeah,
you're not the only person who has seen something like that.
Well, yeah, which is so strange because when I watched The Nightmare with my wife, and she was convinced that I had seen it first because there were so many similar cases in that movie across all parties.
Yeah, and I've had some friends when I lived in South Carolina who shared experiences of being hagged. Generally, sleep paralysis is frequently referred to, at least in my experience, in that region, as just being hagged. And so, regardless of if it's a shadow figure or a woman or whatever they see, it's usually just called being hagged. And so, yeah, I find it interesting that that's such a strong.
That's a really funny term. Well. I'm gonna pocket that one. You just been hagged.
Yes.
And then the fourth time was in the doorway again, where it was a very beautiful woman who looked like she was dressed in like a 1950s summer dress. And she was just standing there looking at me, and then just kind of fizzled away, like almost like pop fizz. Or soda fizz for you Americans.
Depends on the state. Pop fizz is very common here in Utah.
Okay.
Well, that one doesn't sound so bad.
No, it doesn't. But there are times now when I wake up in the middle of the night from having a nightmare, and I just kind of wake my wife up, and I'm just like, check the door, because I just don't look at the door anymore because it's just too frightening and it's too much of a gamble to see that.
And you mentioned your wife had an experience as well.
Yeah, she did. It was when we were in high school. We've known each other since we were like 13. So when we were in high school, she was sleeping, and this was extraterrestrial. So she woke up, and there was a tall gray man standing next to her bed.
Oh, boy.
Like an alien. And he kind of just, I think he just walked away after that. Like she woke up and he was just standing there, which is a really, really interesting because like, I wonder how many people, especially people who believe in aliens and extraterrestrial life, have just naturally sleep paralysis, and they mistaken those as like abduction cases, or same could be said with someone who's very religious and sees a demon, but it's just a image projected by their own mind.
Right. Our consciousness is so influenced by how we're raised, what we believe in, traumatic events. Like, I think sleep paralysis is an incredible kind of way to look at a lot of these visionary experiences that people have had in the past.
Well, what's even more interesting is throughout history, sleep paralysis has been a thing, but you can see how it's affected lore in terms of like there's that famous picture where the demon's sitting on the girl's chest.
Mm-hmm. Right, the classic incubus, succubus kind of a thing.
Yeah, so like obviously these guys weren't having sleep paralysis nightmares about aliens back in 1700s.
Exactly.
So it kind of, or I wonder if it changes throughout culture as well. So it's just interesting to think that it's basically based on your own mind. And Max, you said that you had a story as well.
Yeah, I do. It was kind of an isolated event for me. At the time, I was
for now.
Don't say that. Knock on wood. When this event started kind of happening, it was at the beginnings of a very, very nasty and long divorce that I had been going through.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, I would wake up and I'd look kind of over towards my door again, which is another kind of weird thing that I'm picking up on, is all of your experiences had something to do with the doorway. Your wife's had something to do with the window. I wonder if there's like some
gateway
occult symbolism there going on. But when I first started having them, it was this kind of crouched down, red-eyed shadow man.
Woof.
Which, if in the movie The Nightmare, they actually have a scene with a shadow man with red eyes, and the first time I saw it, it shook me to my core. I could not watch it for a real long time.
That was me and the tall man.
Ugh.
That one really got to me.
And so that one event, I just kind of chalked it up to a weird nightmare. You know, I'm going through all of this anxiety, blah, blah, blah. And then I left my now ex-wife, and that's when, like, the proverbial shit hit the fan. The shadow man was now standing, and I'd see him almost on a daily to weekly basis. And the divorce was getting really, really nasty. It was getting really, really bad. And the more stressed I seemed to be, the closer and closer he would get to me.
Yikes.
He never would touch me. He would never, like, get on me or do anything. But the worst moment I remember is I woke up in the middle of the night. I turned my head, and he was there. And it messes with you. You wake up, and you just feel nauseated almost, because you believe it's, like, physically real and, like, almost violated. Like, who was in my room with me last night?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's arguably, it's saying, like, what makes it not real. Because it feels so real. Like,
all your senses are saying it's real.
Right.
Right. So my therapists got to hear all about that. They sure loved that story.
It's interesting that it was during a stressful time in your life, because the times that I had sleep paralysis was I was working for CTV News at the time as an editor, and I was in my 4th year working there, and I was a nervous wreck based on the content that I had been editing for the last 3 years. And it was probably the most stressful time in my life, and I ended up quitting that job because it was just destroying me as a person. And during that time is when I had all of these experiences, so it does seem to be linked to your stress.
Yeah, and the research I was kind of doing before this episode, that was kind of one of the biggest facets. The second one was it's a genetic thing, that some people are just predisposed to kind of vividly dream and also go into these types of situations.
Right. Well, should we get into the movie?
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, so The Nightmare. It's a documentary film with a lot of like recreations of different things. It's on Netflix for anyone who wants to check it out. I think it's also on Shudder. But yeah, it is quite the movie.
And again, if you're listening to us, you should know that spoilers are going to be all abound. We'll probably ruin this movie if you haven't seen it, so I apologize in advance.
Spoilcast, guys. Spoilcast.
Spoilcast, for sure.
But to be fair, I mean, it is a documentary, and we've already kind of spoiled it already.
It's true. For the most part, I thought it was okay. Like we've mentioned, it's this mockumentary about sleep paralysis as a whole. There's a lot of varied stories, a lot of different people about their experiences with it, what the creators of this documentary think it is, what it isn't, what it means to these people. Like, it's fairly stable in its execution, I think.
Yeah, and so just a little bit of background. So this is made by the same filmmakers who made the film Room 237, which kind of goes into a lot of fan theories about the film The Shining. So it's the same people who are involved in making this. It has the same kind of stylistic elements. I know that one was a pretty widely watched documentary film, especially in the horror community.
Oh, I didn't know that these guys made that. That's a great movie.
Nor did I, yeah. So maybe we should talk about some of the good things about the movie, things we liked, things we enjoyed. Obviously, I've mentioned that it affected me quite substantially with the stupid shadow man and the red eyes. It might be scarier to me because I had that personal connection to it.
Yeah, I would say like like you said just a minute ago, it was an okay movie. I coming from a film background, I was a little annoyed by the the shots that they were doing, the interview shots were like, some of them were just like, why would they do that? Like, that was just weird. It kind of took me out of it a little bit. But when it started kind of getting into the movie and I got over that, they started talking about their experiences. And then once they start bringing them in, like when they start like casting in, like the girl's talking about seeing the guy in the window, and then you see the guy in the window and you're just like, whoa.
Well, and it's all like very well done practical effects too. Like, it's just people in morph suits basically.
Yeah.
Which is crazy to me.
Well, like I feel like the movie definitely hits home with people who have had these experiences more. Like between you and Nathaniel, I feel like it's different, you know, because Max, you've experienced something, and Nathaniel, you haven't yet.
Yeah, hopefully never. But yeah, I feel like that's a very valid point, because, you know, as Max mentioned, you know, the Shadow Man with the red eyes really affected him. When I saw that one, I was kind of like, oh, that one's kind of cheesy for me. Like, I much preferred the scenes where it was showing just, you know, straight up Shadow Men with no features that were just kind of, you know, hovering above the bed, because you know, that's kind of more how I've heard it described. I'm actually have been playing with a short story idea for a long time that involves sleep paralysis and a shadow man. And so that was kind of what appealed to me. And so a lot of the other things, you know, the kind of the more gray alien sort of things, or the, you know, glowing red eyes, kind of didn't do it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is kind of testament to this movie, is there is almost a little bit of everything for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
It has the demon kind of aspect. It has the aliens. It even has kind of succubi, incubi into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also has kind of this weird, like, LSD high
lights
and sounds. And we can talk about that later when we talk about the not so great parts. But
yeah, I mean, like, I feel like this movie, the best part about it was definitely, if they were to just like the best part about it was the reenacting of the monsters and actually seeing what these people were talking about. Like I had mentioned earlier, the audio sensory, where the guy is sitting like that one. There's one scene where there's a guy kind of peering in through a door and he's just like talking to him. Like, that really got to me. I'm like, that's scary.
Yeah.
If it's like some old man talking on the other side of your door and you can only see them.
Yeah, and it's like whispering like weird stuff at you. Like, yeah, that's a trip. That takes it to the next level of scary.
Well, there is something called external sensory stimuli, which is basically, if you're laying in your bed and you're essentially just hitting that REM stage, if there's a noise in your room, it immediately takes part. Your brain immediately interprets it into images. So it's interesting if maybe those voices were coming from somewhere outside, or maybe somewhere else in the house, and this guy's mind was projecting this terrifying scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you talk about that on Knowing My Nightmares. I believe it's either your first or second episode. You kind of relate this dream, but then also make connections that maybe you were hearing the cat meow or things happening outside that your brain was hearing and then twisting and manipulating into something much darker.
Yeah, it is ironic that your brain does set these horrible things up for yourself.
So should we move into some of the not so great things about this movie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it is by no way a perfect movie at all. At all.
No. Like I said, the best parts about the movie are when you see what they're talking about and they do these effects of these people walking in their rooms or these glowing aliens, and well, maybe not that part, but like when you see these things, it is a scary movie. But when you get these guys talking, get them out of here. They annoyed me so much.
Yeah, do some serious editing to make it so their discussion actually has some sort of fluidity to it.
I 100% agree.
The acting felt cheesy almost. And
specifically that one girl.
Yes. Ugh. And I felt like the scary parts were very scary, and then it would cut away to these weird interviews that felt almost contrived and forced, that it completely made the horror fall apart. Like,
a little bit. I was pretty much like the whole time, like, get back to the point.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I felt like a lot of the stories were just so half-baked. Like, I really wish that the filmmakers would have been, okay, I like this story, but I need you to make it more concise. Because a lot of times it was just, like, weird, vague half-details, a lot of, like, repetition, a lot of, kind of meandering around a point for a long time, and it just didn't do it. Especially the dude who always has, like, the weird light show experience.
The one who talked throughout the majority of the movie?
Yeah, I felt like he was probably the person who talked the most, maybe second most, and he just wasn't very good at telling stories.
He felt like the comic book guy from The Simpsons.
I felt the same way. I felt like he could have been reduced, and they maybe could have outreached to other people, whether or not these people are actually people who experience it, or if they're actors. I'm not really sure on that.
They are actual people who experienced it. They're
right. Well, then maybe they should have gotten expanded expanded their roster of actors, or people with experiences. Because I feel like that one guy, and every time they cut back to him, it was like a different day and a different set. Like he was like on a computer and then in a hallway, and it was just like I just couldn't ignore those things.
Yeah, and I also felt like that was another thing that really kind of showed an issue with the show, was that it was very inconsistent in, like, it had, like, weird transitions where they, like, would, I don't know, just show a set being set up for the recreations, and I'm like, I didn't like that. It just felt like they were being lazy and kind of took me out of it.
A little bit.
Or that they would have someone in a studio one day, and then they would have them on Skype the next day, and it just...
Right.
Why?
And I felt, too, that there are a lot of stories, and I really liked the diversity of stories, but they were lacking some sort of cohesion. A few of the stories, like our comic book guy from The Simpsons, as he is now titled, it felt like his experience was more of an acid trip, and then you had the religious lady who it was almost hyper-religious in a sense, and then you had the top hat guy, and I understand that sleep paralysis can be varied and is so, like, personal for different people, but it almost felt like they weren't telling the same story about sleep paralysis, if that makes sense.
Well, I get what you mean. I mean, sleep paralysis stories vary a lot, but what I think is unfortunate about the movie is what the movie did well, they did really well in that they kind of brought these images to life. Mm-hmm. But what's unfortunate is that they kind of didn't show enough of that. So, like, when they're talking about these sleep paralysis, like when I talk about my tall man or hag, that I've been hagged, that's scary and hashtagged. That in itself is scary. It speaks for itself. Mm-hmm. So I feel like if I were to tell that story again, and then again, and then again, it kind of loses its muster. And I feel like a lot of these stories kind of did that, especially with the comic book guy. I felt like, okay, you've said this already.
When there were instances where there were stories that were, like, notably different, like the guy who, his story felt much more alien-y than a lot of the other ones, like, I think maybe they should have presented those stories kind of more as an isolated piece. You told it, front to end, while instead of kind of interspersing it with other things, because sometimes they would say something, and I felt like the filmmakers were implying that it kind of shone light on everyone else's experience, but it was such a different experience that I don't feel like that was the case. And so I felt like it was disjointed because I was getting all of these pieces that didn't quite fit together as if it was being presented as a whole puzzle.
That's a good point.
And I think for me, one of my biggest issues with the movie, and this is kind of a fairly standard rule I live by, is when I watch documentaries like this, I hate when they just jump to conclusions. I felt like The Nightmare did this quite a bit. You had this religious lady who seemed almost hyper religious to the point of not being believable.
Mm-hmm.
And her immediate thought was, there's a demon and it's taking not only my soul, but it's taking the soul of my baby and my neighbors and my cats and my fish.
Run for your lives.
Like calm down, girl. Let's talk through this a little bit. And there was no like substantial scientific or third-party interpretation of the sleep paralysis, which, as we've discussed, if these things are real, then let's lean into that. But let's also take a look at the science, take a look at maybe some other opinions that are floating out there about sleep paralysis.
Right. Yeah, whenever we had a doctor's opinion and it was given to us secondhand, through someone telling a story where they were like, oh yeah, I talked to my doctor and they didn't take it seriously. And it's like, well, maybe let's have some doctors who would take it seriously. Let's have a wider discussion about this topic instead of just having, these very narrow perceptions of it.
Like, Charlie, have you had any sort of, have you seen doctors or therapists, psychiatrists for your sleep paralysis?
No. I have just read a lot of books.
Yeah.
I just kind of, I'm pretty open-minded on, every angle of it, so I just kind of am along for the ride. Also, I'm not necessarily scarred by it. I more so find it as kind of interesting. So maybe if it gets to the point where I, like the one guy, he said that he woke up in the middle of the night and his sleep paralysis caused him to stop breathing. Maybe once I get to that point, I might go see somebody.
And I mean, I was already seeing a therapist for my divorce, and so it just kind of naturally came to light. And they totally, respected it. They didn't think I was insane.
Mm-hmm.
They definitely thought it was related to the stress of the divorce and kind of my subconscious depression and anger manifesting itself in a physical form so that I could battle against it in a way, and so I don't know, there are explanations for things that people often forget.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One other issue I had with the show was that a lot of the stories that were related were from adult people who are, probably 40, 50 years old, and they're sharing experiences that happened to them, sometimes as very, very small children. The guy who had the alien story, who made the mask, he shared a story, and he's like, oh yeah, this is my first memory. I was probably 3 years old. And to me, that kind of inherently, I need to be that much more skeptical of, because it is so far in the past, and it's at a point in your life where memory is so malleable and all of that. And so I felt like, I would, the documentary would have benefited from having people who are, more recently experiencing things or things like that as a bigger part of the base. Because I felt like, too many of the people who were sharing stories from when they were 3 or 4 years old. And I just don't necessarily,
it's not really credible,
have the same weight. Yeah.
And we've talked about on the Screen Kings podcast how memory is so malleable, and you have an event that happens when you're 5. By the time you're 8, that memory is going to be incredibly twisted and distorted and not what it was.
Absolutely. And I never had sleep paralysis until about college. But before that, when I was a kid, I would sleepwalk a lot. So I wonder if it's kind of almost evolved into this. I used to sleepwalk so much that after my car accident, my parents had to put a sensor under my bed, like a pressure plate. And I was so severely concussed that I couldn't leave the house. So if I were to get out of my bed and start sleepwalking, then my parents would know. There was an alarm in the room. And I slept walk once in college. And then since then, it's been sleep paralysis.
Interesting. Well, was there anything else that we did not love about this movie? I feel like we've ripped it apart substantially.
What was your favorite part?
The man with the red eyes, just because I've seen him. Yeah, just because I've seen him, and I have kicked his ass before, so, He went from going from my bedroom to starring in a movie. Congrats, dude.
Oh, he's doing so well.
He's coming up, Max. How about you, Charlie? What was your favorite part?
I would have to say probably the part with the tall guy, when the guy sleeping in the bed with the 2 girls and the tall ghost or apparition comes in and the cat is on the chest. That was a really great part. That, and when the old man is talking through the door. That just really freaked me out.
And you, Nathaniel?
For me, it's pretty much just any of the recreations that featured, shadow men heavily, especially just, the more shadowy ones that were really just kind of menacing. Those really stuck with me probably more than anything else in the movie.
So, as part of the Scream Kings podcast, we love to give movies crowns and screams. Crowns representing how good we thought the movie was overall. Screams representing how scary we thought the movie was overall. For me, I gave it a 5. It's a very scary Netflix movie, I feel like. But as we've just discussed, it's got a lot of issues. It's got a lot of problems.
And that's 5 crowns, to clarify.
Yes. As far as screams go, I gave it a 7, but that's only because I had that very personal connection with that one scene. Had it not been for that, and had I not been so terrified for weeks after, it would be lower for sure, I think.
Similarly, I'm also going to give it a 5 in crowns. Same reasons. I feel like there were moments that really worked and moments that didn't really work. And then for screams, I'm going to give it a 6 just because I think I lack that personal connection that you guys had. So
yeah, I'm going to keep on theme here and give the movie a 5. I didn't think that was that great of a movie. It was still it wasn't bad, but this is where it's interesting because I didn't really necessarily enjoy the movie, but I'm going to give the screams an 8 because, again, it hit me on that personal level, but when I wasn't expecting it, because when I finished the movie, I was like, yeah, that was all right. But then when I went to bed and I woke up in the middle of the night, I really didn't want to go to the washroom because I was like, am I having sleep paralysis now? Am I going to see something in my door? And I kept thinking about the movie and I'm like, is it going to be contagious like they talk about in the movie? I'm like, and then I started kind of freaking out and I'm like, if a movie makes me feel that way, then yeah, it's going to be an 8.
That's fair. For sure.
Yeah, that's very valid.
But I mean, if you really want to see a movie that perfectly sums up sleep paralysis, just watch Haunting Hill House.
Yes.
Hey, we love that show too.
It's so good. To me, that's the best representation of sleep paralysis.
That's fair, and it's also, by the way, one of the best horror novels ever written. So, double whammy.
Nathaniel has a love affair with Shirley Jackson, so you've opened up a can of worms. Good luck.
Speaking of which, we now have a Shirley Jackson shirt.
All right. Well, Charlie, do you want to plug your podcast?
Sure, yeah. This was awesome being a part of Scream Kings. Your podcast is awesome. But I mean, if anybody wants to check out more horror stories and also dream lore and information about the supernatural, then check out Knowing My Nightmares podcast.
Available anywhere you download podcasts, like where you downloaded this one.
Yeah, wherever you get a podcast. Come on, it's everywhere.
Do you have a Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, Grindr, all of those different things?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at KMN Podcast, or if you want to join me on Facebook, it's just the Knowing My Nightmares podcast group.
Excellent.
Yeah, and that's about it. Do you guys want to plug?
Yes.
As well?
So we are Scream Kings podcast. We are available. Once again, everywhere from Spotify to iTunes to everything in between. We also are available on Twitter and Instagram at Scream Kings Pod. And we have a Facebook, but we haven't really done much on that lately. We also have some sweet merchandise available just on TeePublic. If you search for Scream Kings there, you'll find lots of cool t-shirts that I have recently designed, including, as I mentioned, a Shirley Jackson one or two, because Shirley Jackson is the greatest. And yeah, one other thing is that if you like the show, please go on iTunes and give us a 5-star rating and review. It really does so much for helping get the podcast out there, and we would really tremendously appreciate it.
If life gets too scary, you can always wake up.
And stay spooky, friends.
Stay spooky.